really want to be in conversation about this novel, Matrix. And you may have read a few reviews or a description to know it's set on a few facts. And so, Lauren, how about if you start us off talking about that lecture you attended and where and when that spark of commitment to write this book? Tell us about that.
Okay, so I actually, this book came out of 3 separate plats that were braided into it. So the first one is the oldest. I wanted to be a medievalist in college, and I was deeply invested in Ancien Français, which is Old French. It's like Old English. And I was doing translations, and I fell in love with this figure named Marie de France, who was the first published female poet in French. And she wrote these things called lais. Lais are extraordinary. They're short stories that are somewhat fantastical in poetic form. They're wild. They're unicorns running through them. They're love stories. They're based on courtly love that have very codified rules. I just loved her. She was so amazing. She also wrote fables. So for the past 20-something years, I've been deeply, deeply impressed with this woman, and I wanted to do something. I tried to do translations. They didn't work out very well. And then the night before I heard this lecture, and I just remember this in conversation just a couple of days ago, I saw this 1939 film called The Women, which I don't know if it's so good, right? It's such a great film. And the only characters in this film are women. But, you know, it's a product of its own time. The only conversations that they have circle around men. Which, you know, you watching it and you're like, this is such a brilliant, and the dialogue is so good, everything is so good, but, you know, I felt like there was a missed opportunity there. The next day, I'm at Radcliffe. This is this Institute for Advanced Study. It's the most amazing place. They take people from all academic disciplines, so astrophysicists, sculptors, historians, and they put us all into rooms together multiple times a week, and we give lectures to one another. It's to disseminate ideas, to take ideas and just sort of spread them more broadly through academic disciplines, because I think one of the issues with academia is that people get cornered into their own very esoteric ideas. So it's magnificent. Every single lecture I was like, I'm writing a novel about black holes next, right? Like, it was so exciting. So I sit down at this lecture. My friend Katie Bugis gets up. She's a medieval historian at Notre Dame. And she starts speaking, about the liturgical practices of medieval nuns, which doesn't seem all that interesting. But the way that she spoke about it, she was so impassioned. She gets so excited about these women and the way that they built these subterranean networks of resistance to the hierarchy through their work, through their liturgy. And she was so passionate that I was sitting there, and these 3 elements came together. And it's not, you know, it wasn't a mystic's vision. I'm not a medieval mystic, but I did have a vision of the book. It came right in front of me. The book I was working on, I set aside, and I just launched myself into Matrix. Yeah.
The term vision, it just seems so appropriate here, because there are visions in the novel. Okay, so Lauren, as readers, we're always curious about what's fact and what's imagined. So tell us about your research. I mean, the life that people led 800 years ago were very different than what we are experiencing today. And I guess you have to be really careful when you're writing historical fiction, because some academic, right, who knows a lot and studied for years could nab you on some details, could be disastrous for a career. So talk to us about the research part of this.
So the first thing to do for me was to sort of figure out what a biography of Marie de France could have been. Now, this is really, really tricky and difficult because at the time, unless a woman was a queen or, the wife of a king or a saint, there were not many people who were interested in writing down biographical details about their lives. So we don't know much about Marie de France at all. So we have these suppositions. She could have been an abbess in England. They think maybe there's an abbey in Barking or Shaftesbury. These are two great abbeys at the time. She could have been an illegitimate noble. She could even have been one of Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters from her first marriage to Louis XVII, the French king, before she became the Queen of the English. So we don't know anything. So what I did was I took her work, her lay and her fables, and I went through and I plucked out these little details, these beautiful details that seemed indicative of personality, of character. And I built a little flash fiction out of those, and then I made a biography on top of the flash fiction. So that was the most invented part that I did in this book. The rest of it came out of just deep research. I did a great deal of archival research. I learned how to relearned. I used to know, and now I know again, how to read handwriting at the time, which is immensely difficult. I had to brush up on my Latin. Everything had to come back very slowly and painfully. And then I tried to put into the book, almost everything that I put into the book has some basis in fact. Now, a lot of it, or some basis in my research. That's not to say that there aren't things in the book that aren't flights of fancy. There definitely are, but they're predicated on either stories that people told about people at the time. I mean, there are so many stories about Eleanor of Aquitaine at the time that were apocryphal, right? They're not actually real, but people told these stories because news was disseminated through word of mouth. And she was not beloved by a lot of people. And so they would just make up these stories about her evilness. And so some of those stories sort of ended up in the book a little bit twisted. Now, all of the medieval mystics' visions, Marie's visions, come from the visions of other medieval mystics. So they seem somewhat wild and very blasphemous, and they are very blasphemous, but they actually come out of other women's visions. A lot of the details, I didn't obviously replicate them because that's plagiarism, but I definitely took a lot of the details and made them my own. Yeah,
it's kind of remarkable to think that it still exists, that you could still read those words and it didn't get edited. Because a lot got edited over the years, so we are suspect, right, of some texts. Like, whose hands did this reach after the piece was written? So now tell us about what was imagined, because you take us from her life at 17 of being really ostracized, and she's alienated, and she is not beloved. So here's this woman, young woman in transition, and she goes to a place of poverty and hardship and awfulness. So just a warning, that's how the novel starts. It's pretty dreary, Lauren.
There's a pandemic in the beginning.
So tell us about how you sit down to write the vivid and beautiful detail of their daily lives.
So I feel as though my job as a writer is to do about 10 different things at the same time and try to balance them all, and sometimes you succeed and sometimes you don't. But I think the way that I work, and maybe the way to answer this is to go back to the way that I write the books, which is I give myself a certain amount of time to do the research. Usually for this book, I give myself 3 months to do 12 hours a day. I didn't have my children up there at Harvard with me, so I just sort of went. I didn't even eat dinner. I did really hard research. And then after those 3 months, I gave myself a limited amount of time to write the first draft. It was about a month, which seems amazing, except for the fact that this is a draft not intended to be reread ever by anyone ever. So I write in longhand. I can't read my own handwriting, and the whole purpose of this draft is to just get the ideas out on the page and get the scenes, sort of the basic the shape of the book out on the page, and knowing that names are going to change all the way through, characters are going to develop. It's not meant to be reread. So I throw it out, do more research, because the course of the first writing, the first draft, showed me the things that I don't know, the holes in my understanding and my knowledge. And it's draft after draft after draft until finally I allow myself to pay attention to the sentences. And that's my final draft, and that one I try to write more carefully so that I can kind of read my own handwriting and then put it on the computer. But what this does, though, is that it works in some ways as a 3D printer, right? So you're writing layers, and you're slowly building a three-dimensional object that you can spin. And so when you finally do sit down again with this draft, the final draft that you're building, you have these scenes that you can sort of spin in your head and see from different points of view, and they're more objects than anything. So what I do then at that point is really focus on the details. I've done all the historical research that I need to. The book has its foundation, it has its characters. Now my job is to try to understand the world in which I've set these people somatically through the body, because all the characters, if they are alive, are animals, right? We are all animals, believe it or not. And the way that we take in our information is through the body. And so what I'll do with any scene is sit there and then sort of put myself into the scene and slowly, sense by sense, make myself aware of what's happening around the scene. The smells coming up from the bakery, right? The sound of the birds, which at the time were much more loud because there were many more birds. The frogs from the pond. Everything that you could hear, the novices practicing in the distance. Everything that you could hear, everything that you taste, everything that you could smell, and then I finally write the final scene. So it's a balancing of doing a huge amount of structural underpinning work, and then allowing myself to feel bodily joy and pleasure in the sentences, in the scenes. And
boy, this layering, I think you're the first author I've ever heard talk about the layering of the writing. So what part do you most look forward to?
Well, I started as a poet, and I yearn for the day that I'm gonna let myself be a poet on the page. So it's the whole way through, it's sort of building urgency to actually write well, and not these terrible sentences that are not meant to be read by anyone.
Well, there are many points in this novel where you will stop breathing because the sentences are so beautiful. There were many of those moments for me in reading this. So let's talk about Marie. She's an interesting character, and we get to know her from many points of view. She's no saint. She's very human, and yet what you do for us in this story is help us understand some of the relationships inside the nunnery, between the nuns. And I've read a lot of stuff. I grew up Catholic. As a matter of fact, I was telling Lauren, when I was looking for a bookmark, you'd think I'd have a million of them right at my bedstand. So I grabbed this prayer card. This is the one I was telling you about. This is my Aunt Jo, who died last year, and my cousins, because there was no funeral for her during COVID, they sent the prayer cards out. And for many Catholics, especially Catholic women, Mary is a very important figure. She's the only one, speaking from my family's point of view, which is mostly women, she was the only one we could relate to. And during my first wedding, I remember Ave Maria being sung and putting flowers at the base of the statue. So talk some about the female side of faith. And Marie and the relationships of the women in supporting a different kind of faith than we get in novels, or we even get in nonfiction writing.
So this is something that I did see first in research and was blown away by. But in the history of European Catholicism, everywhere you turn, there are these cults of Mary that spring up, because there's an urgent need of the believers in every single place to have a woman at the center. And then every time these cults of Mary spring up, the church comes in and crushes them. I mean, like, this is like the history of the Catholic Church. But it's so beautiful to see this happening over and over, and it's happening now too. I mean, it happens in South America all the time, and then the church comes in and sort of like, this is not cool, guys. But so Mary and Marian culture is a very, very strong, not undercurrent, but simultaneous current in Catholicism, and it's widespread, and you see it everywhere. So I knew that, but I also knew that there are many, many interesting variations on Catholic belief in particular that sort of veer off into feminizing this. And like Jesus, I got very lucky and was able to go to Italy for 6 weeks this summer to an artist colony, which I'm happy to talk about. It was wonderful. But there's this statue of Jesus in one of the churches with a wound in his side, and he's sort of putting his fingers in the wound, and it's very erotic. Right? I mean, anyone who sees this is like blushes, right? Because it's profoundly erotic. And there are these currents where Jesus becomes a feminized figure, and God is seen as a hen laying eggs, like laying the eggs of the world, and a hen is of course female. So there are these undercurrents that are pervasive throughout the history of the Catholic Church, and they're not talked about very much because it goes against the dominant narrative. But I was interested in the non-dominant narrative, right? I was interested in these very real ideas that have been circulating for millennia. So then the women, I went to visit in research for this book, this incredible Benedictine abbey in Connecticut. It's called Regina Laudis, and the beautiful thing about the Benedictines is that they have in the rule, the Benedictine rule, which is very beautiful, and in fact, they still are run by it. Hospitality is a very large part of the Benedictine rule, and so all throughout the world, if you write to the abbesses or the abbots, almost every single abbey or convent has a guest house where they will allow you to stay for a limited amount of time. They will feed you. And at Regina Laudis, they let me work with the nuns who are in full enclosure. And I love them so much. I love them so much. And they let me sit with them multiple times a day and ask all the dumb questions I could possibly come up with. And I made really good friends these nuns are amazing. There was one, just as an offshoot, there's one who was so passionate about cheese making, they sent her to France to get a PhD in cheese making. And there's a movie about her. It's so good. You have to see it. She came back and you eat her cheese and you're like, oh my God, this is incredible. One of my friends, the nun there, she had a full life at the Metropolitan Opera. She was, I think, a wrangler for the singers. And then finally, when she was 50, she said, this is not for me anymore. And she went and she became a nun in full enclosure, and she's just so full of joy. So I love doing this. And I was there in order to see the way that women who only have each other interacted. And I was profoundly moved, to be honest. I mean, one of the things that came up over and over again was that these women, even though there are very strong personalities, and enclosure makes personalities even stronger, as anyone who's ever gotten caught in an elevator knows, right? Like, it's really, suddenly your worst side comes out. Even though that happens, these women are there to death, right? They're there to support each other into death. And the most moving thing was there was a very young nun, I think she was only 30, and she had been asked by the abbess to go and get her nursing degree because she is one of the only young nuns, and she's going to have to nurse her sisters into death in a way that we don't see anymore in secular culture in America, right? I mean, it was very beautiful, this idea of being accompanied by these people you love so dearly all the way through. It was gorgeous. Yeah.
And nuns run hospitals, they're attorneys and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
So,
Activists. Oh my God, they're incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, to this day, they're kind of known for that. Okay, so, but when you're successful, so the Abbey goes from just dire circumstances, and then Marie shows her stuff. And like we're just discussing, that she has successes, but that's not always popular.
No. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was going into this book was, what does power mean? There's this, I'm going to get it wrong. There's this Judith Butler quote that I was thinking about over and over again about how power acts in a transitive sense upon a subject. You become the subject, but the subject becomes the power also. So Marie is in this cyclical, just a cycle where she, in taking power, has to have more power in order to protect her sisters. And she internalizes a lot of the things she's actually subverting at the same time, right? There's this constant tension between her pushing against the dictates of the church and the stringencies of the church, the cage in which she finds herself, but also creating that very same cage in order to maintain her own power. So she's this very complicated person, I think, and everything that she does, she justifies to herself, as we all do. I think when we do bad things, a lot of times we don't think that we're doing them because they're bad, we justify them. So Marie's complicated, deeply, deeply, deeply complicated. Her spirituality is deeply complicated. I find it real, but I find it immensely difficult to parse. Yeah.
Well, you didn't set out to write her up as a saint.
Oh.
And you do a nice job of adding all kinds of texture and situations throughout the novel. Talk to us some about the visions of Mary, why you wrote them in, and why you wrote them in the way you did.
Okay. One of my favorite medieval mystics is this woman named Hildegard von Bingen, who's the greatest, right? Like, she's so, just love her. She's so great. She was a polymath. She was a revolutionary in music. She was this woman who wrote this treatise on medicine at the time that was used for 400 years later afterward. And she's like this incredible human, and she also is a mystic. And her mysticism occurred in her after her fertility left. So as soon as menopause set in, that's when she started getting her visions, which was amazing, right? I mean, that is the inverse of the narrative that we are given today and here. And I love her so much, and I love her visions. And I find her so powerful too, because her visions are very real. I believe very deeply that they were given by God. At the same time, she was able to use them in order to build a space of power for herself and to create this space for her nuns. She built her own abbey, and to sort of build this openness, this freedom for the women through the gift of God. And I think that was an extraordinary gift, absolutely, but also a use of that gift that only a genius, I think, could have been able to use. So I put, it was very, very important to me to find power in Marie post-menopause. Very, very important, because that is a narrative we do not see about women, period.
Amen. Okay, so Lauren, how do you decide when to begin the book and when to end the book? Because obviously Marie has a whole life. This story begins at 17 and ends when she's older in her life. How did you decide when to start and end?
There was no decision. I just, that was just the course of, I think when I was building the book, I kept trying to see the shape of it. And I think of shape in terms of architecture, right? There's this wonderful quote by Frank Lloyd Wright that it goes, form follows function that has been misunderstood. Form and function should be one joined in spiritual union. And so as I'm working toward a mutual split ideas, right? That the smaller the fractals have to build into the whole, and the whole has to repeat itself in the smaller fractals. So it's so all the way through, I just kept seeing the narrative in a micro scale played out in the larger scale too, and they had to balance and be in tune. It's all about balance, and so the balance of this story came through the scenes, and the scenes came through the story, and so the whole time I knew it'd be a life to death sort of. No, I mean 17 years old to death situation. It was mostly contained within the abbey itself.
It's quite a reflection on how you live your life. I found it really profound at the end. Reflective for the reader
not
as
me,
well.
Not how I live my life.
No, I think the reader. I think, and that's my last question, and we're going to open it up for your questions as well. What do you wish your reader gets from this book you created?
Oh gosh. This goes very deeply to the question of what use is art. And I don't think it has a utilitarian use. I think art is there in order to maybe, if it's doing what it should do, to shake the foundations of some of the things that you believe. I think that's something that art can do. But it's also, I want to give pleasure. I want the reader to feel great pleasure when they're reading any of my work. And I want there to be lasting images. I kind of want to colonize people's brains, right? I think books are amazing, right? They're science fiction. You're putting a piece of your own brain into other people's brains. That's like amazing, right? It's powerful. So that's what I want to do, and I want to make it linger. I want it to last for a while. So.
Sure does do that. And I wanted to say on a personal note that there are many books that are well researched and well written. There's a lot of that downstairs. At any given point, we've got 12,000 that we're selling, and 2,000 every week that come out. But about this book, it's not only well researched, but Lauren, I think there's something else in you viscerally that allows you to do your art in such a beautiful way. Thank you for writing this book. I've got a stack downstairs. I'm buying it for every woman I know and love. So thank you for writing this beautiful piece. Who's got a question? Yes.
This is such a tremendous departure from your Florida stories, which is when I first heard about you, because I read a review in the New York Times and I was so fascinated. So I'm thinking, usually an author will stick to a certain genre or a certain subject matter and get deeper and deeper, but you've made a huge departure. So what are you thinking? Are you going to stick with, where you are now, or have you gotten an inspiration or a complete change?
The question is, this book is a complete departure from my stories in Florida, which are contemporary, and they're very angry, and they're about Florida. It's completely different, and the book before is Fates and Furies, and that is very different as well. It's about a marriage. So I think I'm very much an oppositional human, and all I want to do is fight all the time. And when it comes to my next book, I want to fight the previous book. So I think I never want to be a writer who just writes the same book over and over again. That makes me sad. So I always want to kind of blow up the previous thing, do something completely radically different and change. So my next book, I actually was writing it when Matrix came to me and I had to finish it. I finished. And I really love this too. It's another historical fiction, and I think it'll be out in 2023. It's called The Vaster Wilds, and it's basically a female Robinson Crusoe based on captivity narratives in 1609 in Jamestown, which was that starving winter where everyone starved and ate each other. So I'm very, very excited about this book. But what I see Matrix, The Vaster Wilds, and a third book that I'm calling Doom Eager right now, based on a Martha Graham quote. These are these three very weird sisters that have nothing to do with each other. Even the language is different. In Vaster Wilds, it's very Shakespearean. It's got a lot of iambics. I actually used a great deal of Shakespeare's vocabulary, and it has these galloping sentences, and this is very different. All of these books are very different stylistically in terms of subject matter, but they're talking about the same things. They're talking about God. They're talking about the way that we misinterpreted Genesis for domination over nature as opposed to dominion, which is what we were supposed to have, to take care of, to nurture nature instead of crushing it, which is what we're doing. It's about sort of women escaping the confines of the cage in which they were put. So, and they're very, and I don't, they will never be out and under the same cover, but they're talking to each other under the surface. Yeah.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Next. Yes, Anne.
Me or?
Anne, sure. And you go first and then.
Yeah, this is kind of a personal question.
Okay.
But tell us about your husband and how he is integrated into your idea of feminism
and this is a personal question about my husband and how he's integrated into my idea of feminism. Well, luckily, my husband's a feminist, which is great. And my sons are too. I asked my 13-year-old, who's like otherwise like monosyllabic, kind of grumpy, smells a little bit. I asked him if he was a feminist, and he looks at me and he's like, duh. Of course. And I was like, great, this is good. And I actually heard him giving a talk, like a speech to his friends like the other day about like, guys, feminism just means that women just want to be treated like human beings. I was like, yes, that's what feminism is, right? So my husband is my first reader. He is a great reader because he's not a literary person whatsoever. So he's really like a super smart, just general reader. I didn't beat it into him, but per se, but I did make sure over the course, we've been together since 1999. So we were babies when we met, basically. And there are things that I actually had to codify in a written contract in order to make him see the way to build an equal and equitable relationship. So I actually have a contract. And if you all know younger people getting together, I recommend it for everyone. I think a contract is really good. Because before the babies came, the women become the de facto parent. I mean, not just in the relationship because they're, attached to you, but also in like the schools call me first, right? Like just society, that's what they think of as the first parent. And in order to make it equitable, we just sat down where we had to hash it out, and it is a very equitable relationship. He is all for it, and if he's not, he'll tell me, and without a great deal of angst, we work it out.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I just am thinking about something I love so much about your fiction is the way you really do put all the senses in there. And I'm thinking of another great Catholic Southern writer, Flannery O'Connor, who made a point. She was having to teach a fiction writing course at Iowa, and she noted, the problem with most young fiction writers is that they leave out 4 or more senses. And you totally don't do that. But I also love that every time I read a book of yours, I notice that you have got a metaphor for writing. So on page 101 of this, you say, Only when she has recreated in ink upon parchment what she saw, this is her vision of the Virgin, does she fully understand it, she writes in her little book. Visions are not complete until they have been set down and stepped away from, turned this way and that in the hand. And I think that is probably what you do whenever you write. And when you just describe those first drafts and other things, you know, I just love your writing. And I hope I don't jinx it, but I'm pretty sure you got the National Book Award.
There's no wood. Thank you. I'm just going to summarize for the podcast. There was a wonderful story about Flannery O'Connor who said that young writers only use 4 senses. And then there's this lovely line about how I put into my work a line about writing, and that's thank you. And I do that, probably unintentionally. But Marie is a writer, and she only sees her visions when they are written. And same, I only know what I know after I've written it out and cried about it multiple times. Yeah,
Go girl.
Thank you.
Okay, Ralph.
I was wondering what your process is for determining what you've written is any good.
Yeah, the process for determining, this is the perennial question. The process for determining if what I've written is any good. At this point, I've been doing this seriously, meaning every single day of my life, including the days that I went into labor with my children. And I've developed a sense, right? And it sounds very mystical, but I think if there's heat, I can feel it. And even if there's heat and it's poorly done, I know that eventually I'll be able to make it into something. So I don't know. We're all readers in this room, and sometimes we read something you get kind of excited, right? You can feel the heat in the thing, and so you know that it's good, right? And it's more of it's almost a somatic response, right? It's almost a visceral response in some ways. And so you eventually train your body into understanding that what you're doing is worthy of following, I think. And that's really, honestly, that's what practice is. And I feel like it's just the practice of writing every single day, looking very critically at my own work, taking naps, waking up, and seeing whether or not it stays in the head. Yeah.
Would you comment about the sexuality in the Matrix?
Sure. The question is about the sexuality in Matrix. These nuns have sex. Yeah, some of them. So this actually came up in my research. So of course, there are many, many stories of nuns who get pregnant and then have to be cast out of the abbeys and convents where they were. But another thing that I discovered in my research is at the time, the people making the rules were men, period. A lot of them were celibate men, right? Because they were they're clerics. And their understanding of the female form was so poor that a lot of them just assumed that if there wasn't a penis involved in the sex, that it wasn't actually sex, right? That there's no category for lesbianism because it didn't exist, right? They would have called it female sodomy at the time, but that's of course they would have thought that didn't exist. So over and over again in the historical record, you see abbesses with their favorites who sleep in the same bed as them. You see these narratives of nuns with a fixation on each other who, the other, it happens over and over again. And it wasn't necessarily always seen as a sin, or in particular as a sin, because in a lot of the books of the time, it just didn't come up because it was outside of the imagination of the people making the rules. It's kind of amazing. Yeah.
And some of it you have is medicinal.
And it's it's absolutely, it's the humors. You gotta get the humors balanced, right? Yeah, absolutely. There is medicinal sex. And as we all know, come on. Yeah. Not to embarrass anyone here, but yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, one more.
I was just curious if there are any writers who have inspired you as a writer, and what do you read for fun? What writers?
Thank you for this question. We're in a bookstore. We're gonna go crazy now. Okay. The question is, who has inspired me as a writer? Any other writers? And what do I read for fun? So I read everything for fun. Okay. So again, just to go back to my wild obsessive nature, I have to work every day. I have to at least try to write for at least an hour every day, but I have no other job. So I then have 8 hours until my kids come home from school. And so I read all day long, especially during times when I find the writing really, really difficult and I cry more than I write. So I tend to read about 300 books a year, and it's all for pleasure, right? Every bit of it is for pleasure. And when I say books, I also mean plays. You can read a play in 25 minutes, right? They're very short. I don't believe in reading for non-pleasure. I really like everything that I read is for the sheer joy of it. So the writers that I respond to most include, my favorite book is Middlemarch by George Eliot. It's the greatest book ever. Anne Carson is my favorite living writer because she's a poet, but she also plays with forms, with classical Greek mythology. She's like the most amazing. She wrote this book called The Autobiography of Red that is just astonishing. I read a ton of poetry. And again, you can read a book of poetry in 15 minutes. It's not, I read so much. I like now, as soon as the question's asked, like all the books I've ever read go out of my head. So I have big projects sometimes with my friends too. Right now we're reading Proust 100 pages per week, and so we'll be done in like 20 years. But before we read, during the pandemic, we read Don Quixote together, which is an amazing book. We read 2666 by Roberto Bolaño, who is, of contemporary writers. He's dead, unfortunately, but he is magnificent. There's so many great writers. Everywhere you turn, there's inspiration. It's so little time. Joy Williams has this is going in the podcast. She has a new novel coming out but I love her short stories very much. It's called The Visiting Privilege. I would buy that book for everyone in this room if I could.
So what's interesting, Lauren, is not a lot of writers read when they're writing.
That's so nuts to me because I want the voices of genius in my head, right? I want incredible sentences in my head.
I guess maybe it's confusing. I don't get it either.
I don't.
Okay. Well, we're going to go down to the courtyard now to sign copies of books. But before we do that, Lauren, there's a gift from Story and Song. A couple of gifts from Story and Song. And there's this beautiful company called Paper Blanks. And you'll see a whole wall of their beautiful journals. And these just arrived yesterday. So this book bag is something I thought to myself, that's something that Marie de France would have carried if she did. Those manuscripts were part of her money-making scheme. That was a really wonderful thing. So here is a book bag from Story and Song, and also our journal. It just gives me great pleasure to think that maybe one day a thought of yours could go in the Story and Song journal. Thank you so much, Lauren Groff, and congratulations on the New York Times bestseller.